It's a superb book, and this is a night of poetry. And we'll be talking about one of our very favorite poets, Jason Shinder. Not that we don't love all poets, we do, but Jason holds a very special place in our hearts for a number of reasons. And I am, let's see, it's 7:04, so that we can stay on time. I'm going to go ahead and start. And I ask you to please bear with me because I will be reading bios so that you know a little bit about who's with us this evening. So if I'm not looking at you directly, I am thinking about you as I read. My name again is Kat Parnell, and I welcome all of you to Birch Bark Editing's InConversation series. Max Frazier and I founded Birch Bark last February, and we have been on a wild roll ever since. We feature these InConversation events. We are writers and editors. We are always building community.
Yeah, I might go inside, honey.
And we hope you'll support us as we meet and greet readers and writers as we pass through, to steal a phrase from Naomi, the galaxy of time and space. Please mute your mics while we're having the conversation. There will be a chance for you to perhaps have a vocal conversation later. The session is being recorded, so if you object to that, go ahead and hide your face. I know I would if I could. Tonight, poets and writers Naomi Ayala and Ethelbert Miller will lead us on a reading and talk in celebration of the life and work of Jason Shinder, who founded the National Writers Voice Project, served as director of the Sundance Institute Writing Program, and as faculty in the Bennington College MFA program. He authored 3 books of poetry and several anthologies, including the poem that changed America, Howl. 50 years later, we all feel like howling these days. Poet and literary activist Ethelbert Miller also taught at Bennington with Shinder during his tenure there, and a colleague and student of Jason's, Naomi Ayala, her essay on Jason's work, The Practice of Returning, which appears in the this summer, 2021 issue of the Massachusetts Review, will be available for pre-order. I just want to share something with you, and this is just a personal memory about Jason. He met my son in probably the winter of 2006, and they had a conversation, and then Max and Jason, my son Max and Jason, entered in a conversation, and Jason wrote Max, "When I was 14, poems meant a lot to me as well. Like you, I believed and still do in angels. They seem to appear whenever we need them, if we look for them or not look." Do you write poems? It seems to me you will already possess the heart of a poet. To me, that's Jason. He walked with generosity and love and poetry in the world. I don't think he let anyone go by without, connecting with them in some way. That's just my introduction to Jason, and I know that Ethelbert and Naomi will also have a lot to say. Ethelbert is a literary activist and author of 2 memoirs and several poetry collections. Most recently, he received a grant from the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities and a congressional award from Congressman Jamie Raskin in recognition of his literary activism. His latest book, If God Invented Baseball, was awarded the 2019 Literary Award for Poetry by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Ethelbert has 2 forthcoming books, When Your Wife Has Tommy John Surgery and Other Baseball Stories, and The Little Book of E. Please contact us for special ordering information. Naomi Ayala is the author of 3 books of poetry, Wild Animals on the Moon, This Side of Early, and Calling Home, Praise Songs and Incantations. She is the translator of, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, Luis Alberto Ambroggio's The Wind's Archeology, and Death's Shadow, a novel by His Excellency José Tomás Pérez, the Dominican Republic's ambassador to the United States. Naomi has translated and published poems by Lope de Vega, as well as the film script for the documentary Every Child is Born a Poet, the life and work of Piri Tomás. On that note, I'd like to introduce and welcome all of you and Ethelbert and Naomi for this conversation celebrating Jason. Take it away, Naomi and Ethelbert.
Okay.
You're muted.
Thank you for having us, Pat. I am going to begin by sharing Jason's poem, Eternity, from his posthumously published book, Stupid. Eternity. A poem written 3,000 years ago about a man who walks among horses, grazing on a hill under the small stars, comes to life on a page in a book, and the woman reading the poem in the silence between the words, in her kitchen filled with a gold metallic light, finds the experience of living in that moment so clearly described as to make her feel finally known by someone. And every time the poem is read, no matter her situation or her age, this is more or less what happens. And here is his poem, Morning, from Among Women. Morning. There are stones on the beach I should have guessed were birds blown away from the rest. They are speckled with white and gray and green, as if a painter had overpainted. If you ask me anything about it, I will go on telling you the same thing. To be in love is like going outside to see what kind of day it is.
Okay. I'm going to make some comments about Jason, and then I've incorporated some of his poems into my comments. Jason died of cancer in 2008. I also think of people who I met at Bennington who are no longer with us. Liam Rector, of course, Donald Hall, Lucy Gravely, Ritika Vazaran, who gave her last talk at Bennington, and then recently Leslie McGrath, who I remember as a student at Bennington. So I say that in terms of what we're doing with Jason is very important. When we talk about community, we're also talking about remembering. And one of the beautiful things about being a writer is that you touch people, not just with your words, but with your life. And our responsibility is to make sure that that life or that light from that life never is extinguished. Jason Shinder and I met in July 1993. We were both attending the Writers at Work conference held in Park City, Utah. I had been invited to the conference by the writer Gail Ronsky. I had met Gail earlier when she was working at the Foxcroft School for Girls in Middleborough, Virginia. In 1993, she had moved to Utah and might have been studying at that time, I think, with the poet Mark Strand. I met Jason sitting around a hotel pool in Park City. He was reading manuscripts, as was the legendary editor, Carol Huck Smith, who also died in 2008. Carol Huck Smith, who worked for many years at W.W. Norton's, was the poetry editor for Stanley Kunitz, Rita Dove, Maxine Kunin, Gerald Stern, and many other outstanding writers. While Carol was doing serious work, and this is where it's very important, Carol was doing serious work. I mean, she was editing with a pen and stuff like that. I just admired her because I said, well, this is what editors do. Meanwhile, Jason and I immediately started joking back and forth about being two guys from New York, one Black and one Jewish, one from the Bronx and the other from Brooklyn, both now finding ourselves in Utah and surrounded by many Mormons. I don't know how many Black and Jewish jokes and laughter went back and forth between Jason and I, but we immediately bonded like brothers, or two men at the end of the movie Casablanca. I mentioned Casablanca because Jason had a love for movies. Jason's book, Every Room We Ever Slept In, had just been published. I purchased a copy at the Writers at Work conference, and Jason signed it for me. He didn't write my name in his book. Instead, he signed it to Ewok. See page 3. And underneath on the title page, underneath Ewok, he wrote he listed his address and his phone number, inviting me to look him up when I came to New York. And I compare this to Duke Ellington meeting Billy Strayhorn in Pittsburgh. And Duke Ellington said, well, Billy, when you ever get to Harlem, look me up. And Billy Strayhorn would compose Take the A Train, So that was what would happen. I didn't take the A train. I took a plane to Bennington. That would be the next time I would see Jason. So when I turned to page 3, when he says see page 3, afterwards where the poem work is where he signed his name. I'll read the poem work. I notice my old love walking with someone, and I gesture with my glasses should she recognize me. I write this line, fix her safely within it, and hope my poems appear in magazines she reads. As she stands in the kitchen stirring her husband's soup, I hope her eyes fall on my name and the terrible mistake of her life becomes clear. I will then pray for a small earthquake. The cries of the fallen will reach me, and I free everyone except her. Years later, I find her asleep and carry her back to my room, where she remembers nothing but how I saved her. And then underneath that poem, he writes, hi, Ewok, what a pleasure to meet you. Best to you and editor, writer, and Jewish person. That's what he said. He calls me the Jewish person. And I say that in terms of this poem. I like this poem because it touches the romantic in me. And I think of Chet Baker, we fall in love too easily, and how sometimes loneliness is only comforted at times with our memories. When I look at what he says at the bottom of this poem about best you as person, editor, writer, and Jewish person, I think what he was saying, he wanted to keep our laughter and friendship going. And I like the fact that, many times, and I see, I have a joy for sports, the nicknaming is very important. The nickname gives you a sense of how people see you. And sometimes your nickname can be that he's a label and you can't shake it, but sometimes it is a thing which captures your essence. And so I like that he said Ewok, because my other nicknames have been like the writer Kalamri Asalam called me Ishu, like the trickster. But I prefer the Wile E. Coyote, Wile E. Coyote. If you Google, the E stands for Ethelbert. So, I like that, Wile E. Coyote, And so what happened, the humor between me and Jason is what created the bond. And you see this humor carrying over to his poem Proverbs from Flatbush Avenue, which is the second poem I wanted to share. Proverbs from Flatbush Avenue. If you wake up happy, it means you cried all night. If you stand still too long, you'll show your age. When everyone's poor, there's no such thing as poverty. People, they come from everywhere. The worlds are bad fitting and can't be repaired in one sitting. The sky's too big, the earth's too short. If you eat the last thing on your plate, you'll never be married. I like that one. If you eat the last thing on your plate, you'll never be married. If you say hello, you'll have to say goodbye. Sooner take food from a baby than eat pork. Death lasts a year at most, but suffering is forever. I like those proverbs. It's like there's 10 of them. It's sort of like the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament. When I joined the core faculty at Bennington in the early 1990s, Jason was the second faculty member I co-taught with. I began with Ed Orchester, and I would eventually also teach with Emmy Gessler. There was one person that I taught with, but that's another issue. Okay, did not work out well. I still remember a conversation with Liam. I said, Liam, if you ever hook me up with this person, I will kill you. That was my message in the comment to Liam. Anyway, I digress. Looking back, I think the residency thing, which I worked with Jason, was my favorite. It was the one I enjoyed. I felt what we created in our workshop was a strong sense of community. We not only taught and learned, but we bonded. The success of a workshop is first built on the renovation of space, the creating of a place of comfort and warmth, a place for sharing, for finding not just a common language, but a respect for the breaking of bread and communion. I think Jason and I both knew this because our friendship and caring was not an outgrowth of us being writers, but our ability to see something deep inside each other, a place where silence too often resides. And I go back to that last line in his Proverbs, where he says, death lasts a year at most, but suffering is forever. And maybe later on, Naomi may want to comment on that because that seems like a Buddhist teaching right there. Jason Shinder was a man of many ideas and projects. He invited me to contribute to 2 anthologies. He edited this birthday poems, edited in 2002. I contributed an essay for his book, Tales from the Couch. And I would say there's one book that, you know, you really might want to go and pull is this book, Tales from the Couch, Writers on Therapy, published in 2000. There's 17 contributors, among them Susan Shiver, Mark Dottie, and Tazaki Shange. And this book, I believe we had a panel discussion about this book at the AWP conference. And what I like about this, and I go back to how writers autograph books, in this book, Jason wrote to the following: to Ethelbert, dear friend, dear poet, dear soulmate, and keeper of our tales. And I'd like to underscore the fact that he saw me as a soulmate. And sometimes what happened when I read his poems, the poems which are sometimes romantic, but also deal with loneliness, I feel that, yes, we are soulmates because those are some of the themes I explore in my work. I believe if Jason was living today, he would be 65. So let me end my comments with a poem by E.E. Cummings that he included in his anthology of birthday poems. So this is 65 in the nice birthday poems that Jason edited, 65. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and the blue true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I who have died am alive again today, and this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life and of love and wings and of the gay, great, happening intimately earth. How should tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any lifted from the know of all nothing, human merely being doubt imaginable you? Now the ears of my ears awake. Now the eyes of my eyes are open. So much about Jason Shinder was about yes. His love of poems, movies, dance, and yes, he will always be with us. And yes, we will always love him. And yes, we will miss him. Yes.
Thank you, E. I wanted to, before I shared some thoughts about Jason's work and this essay, thank Ethelbert, because Ethelbert was twice responsible for a link that helped me write this essay. First, you know, while Bennington's MFA program had an autodidact policy, I was admitted into the school under that autodidact policy. And so to me, you know, the vision that Liam Rector had in founding the program was very important because it accommodated somebody like me, who had, you know, had a quite decent education, but an alternative education prior to getting my master's. And Ethelbert, I guess I talked about, Ethelbert have for many years had a bi-weekly breakfast where we meet at a local spot and just talk shop of writing. And I guess I had talked enough about Jason, brought him up enough that he started asking me to write about it. And I thought, oh, never. You know, I really felt such kinship with Jason and was connected to him in so many ways that I thought it would just be too painful to write. And indeed, it was like tackling a monster. It took me 8 months to write it, and you know, crying through the entire thing. And you know, I don't mind writing about feelings, but I'd rather not always be absolutely drowning in them while I'm trying to produce something that may be somewhat creative and at least somewhat critical in some way. And so thank you. Ethelbert is directly responsible for my having taken the time to sit down and reflect on Jason and his contribution to me and to so many of us. I titled the essay, The Practice of Writing. And I'm a Zen practitioner. I took my precepts in the Japanese lineage 3.5 years ago. And so when I think about Jason as a poet and as a teacher, to me, he embodies what Zen is. And if Zen is not something that you have contemplate in any way whatsoever, let me tell you that the most important thing about it is to be present. And so to be present is to be vital, is to be alive, is the élan vital, the vital essence of being, is to be right here, right now. No past, no future, right here, right now. And so to me, he embodied this. I met Jason, well, first I saw his photograph at the West Side YMCA when I had walked in, one of these young writers wanting to take my first craft. Jason's, writer's voice headquarters, that's where it was based. And I thought, oh, okay, that's the guy. I was also a young arts administrator. So to me, I thought, oh, this person actually, he does this and he writes and he teaches somehow. And so ironically, a number of years later, I, continued developing programs and designing community programs in the arts, and eventually met Jason in person because I was the administrator hired to be the program director of a new Writer's Voice project in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I was living in Connecticut at the time. And so he became my boss, and this is how I first got to know him. He was always available. Bridgeport at the time was one of the 10 poorest cities in the country. And it was overrun with gangs. At the same time, this fine edge, like where I live in DC now, it was also, there were two extremes. There were the very, very poor and then the very, very wealthy. And so they often did not come together. So I was in this neighborhood that was right on the edge of all that trouble, and right on the edge of all that privilege. There were constant obstacles, and Jason was always available to me, always available to the program, helped us bring in some incredible writers that at the time we were lucky they came to Connecticut at all. Never mind to some place near Bridgeport, it just did not happen. Later, he was my teacher at Bennington, and I thought about wanting to write about this. I think also of my friend Michael Weaver, and Jason and he have a lot in common. There are people who give themselves so entirely and so wholly to their teaching that you really wonder how the heck they can balance that with a private life and being an administrator and being committed to your writing still. It's quite a balancing act. I mean, we should be having conversations about people like this all the time and getting to know them and figuring out how in our most humble little lives we can emulate them in some way. And so to me, you know, I thought that that contribution was so great that it almost overshadowed his writing. And I felt that his writing has never really received the merit that it deserved. So to me, what was close to my heart about this writing about him, about this essay, was being able to recall some of those poems that I thought were particularly good and impactful, although all of his writing is. The poem that Ethelbert read a few moments ago and talked about the ending and suffering less, however, less among time. It reminds me of Neruda's line, you know, happiness, you know, life is so short, but oh so wide, you know, it's short but wide. And to me, Jason was a lyrical poet. He reminds me so much of Neruda, and he was a poet of capturing that moment and looking after the line that let moments end. And so if we read some of his poems, we'll see not only that influence in terms of the lyrical depth and lyrical quality, that music, but also, you know, that utmost respect for the visual arts. And I think Jason was also an incredibly visual poet. Not all poets are. And so that is, you know, he was also sensual. So that is a perfect marriage of many different elements coming together. For me, his suite, The Lives of the Romantics, is particularly exemplifies this. I think as a student, as a teacher, he presented some important questions to us. How do you stay present with all that is? And how do you walk in balance with beginner's mind and with being a critical thinker? And how do you bring those two together? So he wasn't content with just assigning us writing, you know, and holding us accountable for writing, whatever it was we were writing, and for offering feedback, but also for having us reflect critically upon what we were writing. And so, you know, I feel that there's not often enough of an emphasis on that. We read and we write, we read others and we reflect on their work critically, and we read and we write, and we're so desperate for comments, and we want comments. We want to be steered in the right direction, but we are not taught to apply those same critical thinking skills to our writing, to step back enough from it and look at it. So I wanted to share with you a little checklist that he'd have us think about. He used to talk about your temperaments, getting to know your temperaments as a poet. What are you concerned about? And so this is one such set of questions that I took down. I kept a journal. He was so quotable. Every other thing he said was worth writing down. But this is our checklist. And we had to write about this. We weren't just to reflect on it. What are your image clusters? What are the things you keep repeating? How do you open and close? What are your progressions? What is your breakthrough work? How do you read as a writer? How do you read? Why do you read, and who do you read? What do you bring to the table as a poet? What are your resources? And so, even though I had already written and published my first book by the time I made it to Bennington, and ended up in Jason's class. I had never thought about my work critically prior to this. I just bothered to write and write and write, and I wrote a lot, but I had not, what were my resources as a poet? I was totally stumped. What are they? And image clusters. Do I have to read everything I've written and look for these? So just being able to be made aware and knowing even what kinds of questions to ask. I was really, as a poet myself, I was committed to growing. And so from the moment I first started to write, the most important thing to me is to always be growing or stop. And so having the great fortune to come across such a gifted teacher like this, that encouraged everyone to just be growing all the time, and to find a way to know how you needed to nourish yourself as a writer so that you could continue to grow. And how were you going to ensure that you made that investment and that you committed to continuously making that investment? And so this is a serious thing. How do you do all these things and then remain also a normal human being and meet, all the other responsibilities that you have in your life, fulfill your other roles. I think those of us who mean to continue to grow and write, for the long term, are very fortunate to end up with someone like this. One last thing I say, he had us keep this so-called inspiration binder. And I still do. Mine has become digital now, but at one point it used to be a literal physical binder, where he'd have us keep all kinds of things that inspired us and motivated us. And I used to think of my journal. I tried to make my journal over the years be something like that prior to meeting Jason. But after I met him, I started to look more. I never thought I needed anything as a writer except time. I just wanted time. And I thought this was like the greatest struggle ever. And once you get time, then you should know what to do and just move forward. Do it. Do what you got to do. Do your job. And so it was, although this may be, particularly relevant to people like me, it was really good. It was really healthy to be able to think about, have a place, a placeholder for what fed me as an individual poet, other than reading and other than being with other writers. What fed me? How could I nurture my creative imagination? And what was that landscape, the landscape of my creative imagination? What did it need? And so I think for me, particularly as a woman, in my 50s now, I never had an opportunity to think about what I needed, especially for my creative imagination. I just did and just tried to do as much as possible. So, his gift continues living not only in us who know him and are here today, but in so many other poets around the country. And I used to hear growing up that, writers, they get to live forever. If you publish, you get to become immortal. I think that maybe a part of us might become immortal, but the essence of who we are isn't always, our writing is not always the best place to make that manifest. I think some people, they're worth knowing personally, and we're lucky to have met them and had them in our lives.
Naomi, I'm always looking at writers' lives closely. And I'm going back to this Tales from the Couch, this anthology that Jason put together. And also the AWP panel, because there were a number of people who felt we shouldn't have a panel about, you know, mental illness, therapy, things of that sort, depression. And I remember, I might have been on the board of AWP at that time. I said, well, obviously we need to address this because everybody's drinking you know, heavily at the AWP conference. And something's happening there. You know? I think there needs to be some clues, you know. And in the same way, you know, I look closely at Jason's books, and even this one, as I said, others are in downstairs, but you know, I always look at his covers, and there's a degree of loneliness, there's a degree of something happening there that's not being articulated, you know. And I'm looking at this short poem that he wrote called Company. And it's very short. I've been avoiding my illness because I'm afraid I will die. And when I do, I'll end up alone again. That's a very short poem. And he must have wrote that, you know, that when he was battling his illness. And I was looking at the poems carefully, and I saw these themes in terms of, you know, relationships, but I also saw this a sense of loneliness that comes there. And that's why I go back and I said, well, you know, when you connect with people immediately, something happens there. And so when I go back and I saw, okay, Jason, you know, including me in this book, called me his soulmate, I realized that he was capturing something that was I connected with. Because many times, and you might think about this in terms of Bennington, think of graduation and no Jason, nobody to dance. You know, I think Jason was like a ballroom dancer. You know, I always, you know how you like, well, what would happen if Babe Ruth played with Barry Bonds? You know, I always was wondering, it's like if, you know, we could hook up, you know, Jason with Rita Dove, you know, put Fred aside and just have Rita Dove dance with Jason, you know, because what happens is that he was the center. You know, people graduate, you know, but people would wait for Jason to dance. And he was this marvelous dancer. You know, everybody would be forming a little circle and just watching him. And I say that because when you deal with issues of depression, the demons that sometimes we face, we outwardly look like we're having fun, that we're the joy and the stuff. But if we are writers, sometimes we deserve critical reading. And sometimes what happens is something else that's happening there. And I always looked at the fact that Jason was always doing projects. So why did he do this one? Okay, and then since this is a Bennington program, many of the contributors who are on the couch are from Bennington. So, you know, so I mean, I just say that in terms of one, you know, if you get up there and you're not accustomed, you know, with the winter and stuff like that and the cold and the snow, you're from like California, and you're a writer and you're wrestling with some problems, just trying to get something, you know, in your poems or your novel that you're working on, it can be tough. It can be tough, you know, and many of us, what drives us to write is sometimes these demons. You know, what drives us to sort of explore these relationships is why we write. And sometimes what happens, Naomi, you want to?
Oh no, true. I mean, I'm just thinking, aren't we all plagued by that? I think, you know, to be present, it's not always joyful. And to hold the awareness of, let's say, for example, right now, everything that we know is going on in the world right now. And at the same time, the moment in the space and the time we occupy in our own lives, you know, in comparison to that. And writing. So I think as writers, we're charged with this incredible, we bear this weight of being both witness and a participant. And the writing is, I think, it's the space where it can come together, you know, and I think we're all plagued by that loneliness. I think when we kind of cross borders and, you know, throw a bridge across one another, we're able to in community. So it's the best antidote for that. But I think in our own private space and time, I mean, I just think, how could you not feel lonely sometimes? How could you not? to me personally, I look at it as this kind of awareness of, you are present and you do believe in joy and hope and all these good things. And at the same time, you know exactly what's going on. So how do you hold those together?
Right. And I think another thing that when we remember Jason, another person who we should always think about because it's that connection, and that is Allen Ginsberg. And so it'd be interesting to see exactly, that strong influence that he had, because if I'm not mistaken, I think he was like Ginsberg's assistant at one time. I know he did the book on Howl. And I say that because what happens is that I remember Ginsberg would always, do this whole trace himself back to Whitman, I think that anybody, who's around Ginsberg, and I've only experienced one workshop when I invited Allen Ginsberg and Mary Baraka down together. And I remember we had them there reading together, but they also had workshops. And the workshop that Allen Ginsberg gave was so memorable, so memorable that you learn how to break your lines yourself. And I say this in terms of one of the things that Jason did in the class where we taught together, which is it's a simple task, but he would always have somebody to be assigned like the recorder. And whenever somebody mentioned the name of any writer or whatever, to write that down. So that at the end of, our part gatherings, you would have a bibliography. You would have names of writers that, you hadn't read. And so, he was always looking at how you could create things. And then the other thing, which I always liked about Jason, and maybe this sort of rubbed off on me, he was an idea guy. And then he was an idea guy. Okay, we're gonna do this. I mean, who's gonna birthday poems? Okay, we can do birthday poems, things of movies. I mean, that type of energy, that type of completion of the task. And what you can look at is that you can look at the different dates in terms of copyright dates. How long is he taking to do these things? He's extremely productive. And I say that because, he only lived to be 65. But, if you look at the number of anthologies and books that he was collecting, information from, that's a substantial career. Okay. One can almost say that this take away from his own writing. I mean, consider this. You're working with Allen Ginsberg, which is the guy keeping a diary every minute, writing everybody, taking pictures. And then you're also dealing with your own work. You're also teaching, running, programs. I mean, that's amazing in terms of his accomplishments. And he's touching people's lives, And what I liked about Jason, he's the type of person that, if I was coming into a program, he would make me feel welcome. The same way, when I went out to Utah back in those days, I was really impressed when someone stopped me on the road in between Salt Lake City and Park City and asked me for directions. Because when I got there to the airport, I walked through, somebody thought I was Karl Malone. That was the only other black guy that was out there playing for the Utah Jazz. But I say that in terms of what happens is that when I walk into that space around that pool, it's just Carol Hogg, and all of a sudden, I felt comfortable. I didn't have on a bathing suit like I came to swim. I was just hanging out because it was a place where at that time there were no Mormons there, and nobody in my workshop. They wanted me to read their work, and so what happened? It was so relieving just to have a joy, and that wherever you go, when you have an encounter with somebody, that's what you remember. If I think, for example, I think of Park City, I think of Jason. There's no way I can think of Bennington without thinking of Liam Rector. And so what happens, we begin to associate people with places. And this is what makes it so difficult sometimes when we deal, those of us who are the survivors, and with that loss. Because sometimes we're torn between, do I go back to Bennington or do I just let it be a memory? And that's the thing. That's why I'm glad that we're having this, because it forced me to go back and pull, some of the things that I didn't realize that Jason had included me in so many of his projects until I began to look closely. And then I began, as I showed you, I began to look very carefully at what someone wrote in the book, because when you look at how people autograph books, sometimes it's just a name, and that's it. And sometimes you look at your book and the 50 people at in the bookstore have the same thing. I love you, right? Okay, we love everybody. But the fact that what happened when he sat down to write the autograph the book, something was happening. He was like saying, okay, Ethelbert, here's my book, but here's my hand, and let's make sure our friendship continues.
In honor of Jason and in celebration of his work, and since we do have a very small group here, I would like to open this up. I know you can't see me, but this is Kat Parnell speaking. I would like to open this up to anybody who would like to ask questions or has a comment.
Can we call on people? Can I say
Lori?
Yeah. Lori, where's Lori?
Where's Lori? Lori, come on, speak up, Lori. I'm going to unmute you, Lori. Where did she go? Oh, she's hiding.
She's hiding from me again.
Oh, she's.
Oh, can you hear me?
There's Lori.
Now, Lori. Yes.
You can't hide, Lori.
I'm just laughing because I was in Ethelbert's workshop as well as Jason's at Bennington, and Ethelbert would always call me out. I mean, and sometimes it was very critical, Ethelbert, but that's really funny. It's so good to see all of you. And one of my favorite people in life, of course, was Jason and still is Jason. And some of my favorite poems are by Jason. And I just love that we're thinking of him and remembering him. So yeah, he was a huge influence on my life, but I saw that in everyone who was his student. And it's so true what you were saying, Naomi, about how he taught and how he stayed a presence in our lives as students and stayed in touch. And it wasn't just taking a poem we might have written and critiquing it. It was really digging deeper and pulling out of a student far more than at least I thought could happen. But I'll just say one brief thing, and that is that speaking of what Ethelbert was talking about, the first time I had not met Jason Shinder, but I had his book, and I think it was Every Room We Ever Slept In. Yeah. And I wanted him to sign it. When I got to Bennington, I wanted him to sign it. Didn't know the guy. So I was kind of scared, and I walked up to him and he just stared me down. He wasn't necessarily friendly. He just stared at me. And I was so awkward. And I said, "Oh, hi. Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, but would you mind signing your book?" And he just looked at me and he took it out of my hand and said, "Now go away so I can think." That's what he said. I was just like, I couldn't wait to go away. And I went on the other side of Tishman and just sat there, and whoever was giving a presentation or lecture or whatever was talking. And I kept saying to the students next to, my colleagues, saying next to them, "Jason Shinder has my book. What if he doesn't give it back to me?" Like, that's what I was concerned about, So, and I afterward went back over to him awkwardly and asked for and just stood there kind of like, "Do you remember you have my book?" And he gave it back to me and he said, "Here." And he just looked at me and he said, "Thank you," to me. He thanked me. I was like, oh, that was kind of nice given the way he was before when I asked him for the thing. And I walked away, and he said, I won't repeat exactly what he said in the book. It's very personal, but he really wrote something very personable and personal. Took time. He had asked me my name and he wrote my name in it. And then he said this, and then he said something really, really kind. And it was way more than some poet is going to write in your book. I treasure it. So I just related to what you were saying, Ethelbert, about that. He's a great guy.
It's that relationship building too, that community building. He was always present in that way and connecting people with one another. So, yeah.
He also had, and we all know this, such a great sense of humor. In my last term, it was his time to give a reading at Bennington. So he called me on the phone like maybe 2 months before the June residency, and asked me, he beat around the bush for about 20 minutes. I didn't know what he wanted, but we went all over the place. And then finally he said, would you introduce me for my reading? And I was like, of course, over the moon. I was like, oh, this is going to be great. Oh, this is great. And I said, of course, of course. And he was very thankful and sweet and kind in the way he is and was. And so then that was the end of that. 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from Jason Shinder, and he said, what are you going to say about me? I said, you do not need to be worried. I said, well, maybe a little, because I know a lot of things about you that you may not want me to say, but get ready, like that. But he was concerned. I thought it was the funniest thing ever. It was funny.
We did get this is Kat again. We did get a question from someone before this event. And this is just very typical of the way Jason made all of us think. And the question itself is, it's actually from Gabe. So I'm going to go ahead and name you Gabe, sorry. And what she said was, when I was working with Jason at Bennington, he asked me, what are you afraid to write about? And it was the opening of a running conversation, this is according to Gabe, that we had over many months and helped me take more risks in my own work. So her question, of course, is to Ethelbert and Naomi, what are you afraid to write about? But the bigger question really is, what does Jason do to encourage us, even now, to write about what we're afraid about?
Well, I'll answer that because I've written 2 memoirs, and a number of people who know me very well will say, you haven't written your memoir yet. And some people, for example, I just maybe go back to Jason and sitting around the pool. I remember my friend Barbara Berman, we used to run a press together called Enemy Press, feminist press in the 70s. And she said, Ethelbert, I read your memoir and you said nothing about your relationship with the Jewish community. And I found it very interesting. And I went back and said, wow, you know, there's no reference to my involvement with the Jewish community. There's no reference with my involvement with the Palestinian community, you know, and there really is, I really have not written anything about Howard University. And that's where we probably began, you know. It would also be a thing in terms of writing about relationships that need to be expanded on, you know. So, I mean, I haven't written about my relationship with June Jordan in terms of the way I would like to write about it. There's still some space there. I haven't written about my present marriage, and I haven't written about my first marriage, really. You know, I've dedicated books to people, but there's a fear in terms of one being so honest, especially in a memoir, that you're not necessarily dealing with people who are living, or, you know, you seal your something in your archives for whatever years after your death. You never know exactly how what you write is going to affect future generations. And I'm looking at now that says I'm a grandfather, you know, how my grandchildren might read. You know, I know how my children are dealing with this stuff, but, you know, you never know exactly what you're writing. And when I'm doing my memoir workshops, I always tell people, don't write a memoir to get back at somebody. Don't write it something with anger. But then I realized one of the things that I have not tapped into is that anger. And I'm sort of afraid of that because I saw that anger in terms of my father. You know, he did not get upset, but when he did, it was terrifying. You know, and that's why I always tell people, in my house growing up, my father was the Supreme Court. In some cases, never got to him.
For me, thank you for bringing up that question, because I remember that as one of the very first questions that Jason asked, and thank you, Gabby. And it's actually in the journal I kept during his class. And at the time, I was just, as a writer, a completely different person. I think for me, I tried to write about the things that I'm afraid to write about. Lately, I am working on moving toward two things that are difficult for me to write about, and that is, you know, my departure from Puerto Rico in the late 70s and the events that led to that. And so I've been working on and off on that for some years now, never having quite yet found that that's gonna keep me returning to it. And then writing about lupus. I'm a lupus warrior. And so writing about what it's like to live with a chronic illness and what that's like. There's so many misconceptions about this disease and so many myths about it, and being able to write, I would like to make a contribution in that way, whichever form it takes. When I was first diagnosed, I wrote a suite of maybe 12 or 15 poems about the process. And they say that the first 3 years of diagnosis are the most difficult and the most challenging, and that you've already probably had the disease for at least 7 years. And so this is a disease that mostly affects women and women of color, not exclusively, but mostly since the beginning of time. So those are kind of my two things, and I'm moving in that direction as best as I can.
Naomi, thank you for that. And Ethelbert, you too. Thank you for that very important honesty. And before we close out, because we at Birchbark honor the idea of an hour is an hour, and it is very meaningful in terms of the time and space in our lives. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to add? If so, now's the time. Anybody? I do want to express to everyone who came this evening, as well as Naomi and Ethelbert and my partner, Max, how very important this event was to me, because community is so important to me. And I think I learned about community from my colleagues, my friends, my masters, really, at Bennington, and that includes Ethelbert, that certainly includes Naomi, and Victoria, you're there, it includes you. And I value everything that you have to say. I'm grateful that Naomi has written this essay. I encourage everyone to please go to the Massachusetts Review site. We've got it listed on our website and then also in the chat, and buy this essay. For those of you who knew Jason, you'll not be able to put it down. For those of you who want to know Jason, Jason will become part of you. So on that note, with love and gratitude and poetry, I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening, and we'll see you again at another Birchbark event. Thanks so much. I'm going to end things.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.